Hey guys, Mr. Breen here, and in this video I'll be talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, so what does this model look like? Well, before I start on the model, I just want to mention, recently I heard Nobel laureate in economics Lars Peter Hansen from the University of Chicago saying that all models are wrong, and that is true. They're not perfectly correct, right? It's like an analogy or a metaphor, right? It always breaks down somewhere, but it can be useful in understanding certain things about an economy. So this is a model that is helpful in understanding microeconomics issues, so we're going to just adapt it for macroeconomics. Remember, economics is about aggregates, which is everything all together added up as one. So supply, demand, quantity, and price. Okay, so we're going to have, instead, aggregate supply, the supply of everything. Okay, and then aggregate demand. And interestingly enough, we're actually going to change the supply curve. So instead, it looks something more like that. And because there's not one price in the whole economy, we're going to change the P there to price level. Okay. Remember, if the price level goes up, you have inflation. If the price level goes down, you have deflation. And then instead of quantity, what's the quantity of everything all added together? Well, that's output or total production. Or we might simply say real GDP. Okay, let's take a look at how this works a little bit, and then we'll talk about why things look as they do. So let's say that aggregate demand goes up. Okay, there's aggregate demand 2. Now, the GDP will go up, right? You can see. And what else will happen? You'll get some inflation. So usually, when GDP goes up, we have some inflation. Okay, if aggregate demand goes down, aggregate demand 3, instead we're going to get some deflation potentially, or just disinflation or something like that, and GDP will go down. Okay, you're going to hate me for drawing this many lines, but let's say that aggregate supply instead, let's say aggregate supply, that's a big increase in aggregate supply. Okay, so our old equilibrium was there. All right, but our new equilibrium is there. So instead of having let's see, well, actually, we're going to have some disinflation or deflation, and then GDP is going to go up. Okay, but if aggregate supply decreases, so let's say aggregate supply sort of goes to the left there. Okay, again, sorry for drawing so many lines, but the price level will go up and GDP will go down. Okay, so a few rules of thumb here. One is that aggregate demand is basically consumer spending at, let's say, at a given price level. At a given price level. Okay, so if consumer spending is low, okay, if it's low, that can lead to deflation and low GDP. If it's high, the opposite. We might have instead inflation and growth in GDP. Also, aggregate supply does not equal output. Okay, output is on one of our axes, right? It's on the x-axis. No, instead, aggregate supply reflects our actual production capacity, right? So it kind of looks like that. And we get this vertical asymptote. Hopefully you guys know what this means. If you don't, you can look it up. Asymptote, this line, this amount of production that it's going to get closer and closer and closer to, but never quite going to reach, because there is, well, it's not really an asymptote, but it's enough like an asymptote for us. Okay, because this is the maximum production level, at least in the short term. Right, in the long term, we can increase our capacity, but in the short term, well, it takes a lot of doing, right? Building more factories and digging more stuff out of the ground and stuff like that. Why is it curved? Well, because of the law of increasing cost, right? At a low price, well, so if we're going to produce this amount, then we're not going to have to pay a whole lot in terms of wages and prices for goods. But if the entire economy starts to hum a little bit, and you're going to have to tempt people into the workforce that weren't in the workforce before, you're going to have to buy resources that perhaps went fallow before, just sort of were not being used. And this process increases and increases and increases and causes inflation, right? Because you need to raise wages in order to get people back into the workforce, and you're gonna end up having to pay a higher cost to get, say, more oil out of the ground, or to use more space as factories, and you're going to get less out of all of that stuff. So what all this means is something that many people don't realize sort of on the first time around, which is that an increase in output is not an increase in aggregate supply all the time, right? Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's just an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand went up, so the quantity produced went up, but aggregate supply stayed the same, right? And if that happens, you're going to get some level of inflation. You can draw this out yourself. I just did a few minutes ago, right? So, I'll say something like, well, what if the United States goes to war? And they'll say, well, aggregate supply will go up because we'll need more stuff. And it'd be nice if the world worked that way, but the world doesn't really work that way, right? And aggregate demand would certainly go up. Now the government needs tanks and planes and all that stuff that you use to fight a war, but you still have the same amount of capacity. You still have the same maximum production level you did before until you build more factories, and that takes time. Okay, so far you've seen how inflation and GDP fit into this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So, if inflation goes up, but GDP goes down, in other words, we have stagflation, then you might be able to pinpoint decreasing aggregate supply as a cause of that, right? If inflation goes up and GDP goes up too, then maybe it's aggregate demand. But how does unemployment fit in here? Well, GDP, price level, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay, basically our rule here is that if GDP goes up, unemployment goes down. And if GDP goes down, unemployment will go up, at least cyclical unemployment. Okay, again, when there's a downturn in GDP, we expect some cyclical unemployment. Okay, when there's an upturn in GDP, we expect cyclical unemployment to go away. So if aggregate demand increases, okay, we're going to have inflation because there's an increase in the price level. Okay, we're going to have GDP going up, and we're going to have unemployment going down. And if aggregate demand goes down, just the opposite will happen. Instead, we'll have maybe disinflation or deflation. GDP will go down, and unemployment will go up.